legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Camille Sauvé, who joins us to discuss her book, Sorcerers of Stone, Architects of the Three Ages. All around the world are mysterious ancient monoliths with strange features and abstract forms with underground grottos and cave systems. Most archaeologists cannot explain them and attribute their construction to the earliest known cultures in the area. Examining sacred sites in Peru and their counterparts around the world, researcher and journalist Camille Sauvé shows how these sites share specific architectural characteristics and reveal evidence of a very ancient culture that once existed worldwide. Weaving a tapestry of what early humanity looked like, Sauvé examines the writings of famous clairvoyants like Rudolf Steiner, Madame Blavatsky, and Edgar Cayce, who recorded the works of early man through the Akashic records. Besides the more esoteric questions about who could have built these wonders, the author also examines the unique properties of the monoliths themselves and the sophisticated science behind the construction of these sites. She shows how they seem to be placed on Earth power spots and how most of the rocks have significant piezoelectric properties from high quartz and silica content. Revealing that many sacred sites are much older than previously thought, Sauvé shows that Peru may hold the secret to remembering our forgotten prehistory. Hello and welcome, Camille, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you so much, Greg. It's wonderful to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Excellent. Well, today we're going to be talking about your new book. It's entitled Sorcerers of Stone, Architects of the Three Ages. Before we dive into that, just for listeners who don't know, give them a little information about your background and your work in general.
Sure. My main employment is as a graphic artist, but I'm kind of semi-retired, and I've been here in Peru now for 5 years, and I have been exploring basically this amazing country, and found myself really fascinated with what I was seeing in the archaeology record, especially around the Cusco region where I live. And this has kind of taken me on an odyssey of really digging in deep and trying to understand what I was seeing, because I was seeing things that didn't mesh with what a lot of my guides, the guides that were showing me around Sacsayhuaman and places like Ollantaytambo, were saying about the site. So I just started digging in a little deeper and discovering some artifacts and basically monoliths and megaliths that didn't fit in with the actual narrative I was hearing from most mainstream archaeologists and the guides that I was walking around Sacsayhuaman with. So yeah, this is why I wrote a book called Sorcerers of Stone, Architects of the Three Ages, to really explore some of the anomalies that I was witnessing and try to make sense of it.
So in the recorded introduction, I've said a little bit about the book, so listeners will already know about some of the main themes. For me, the first thing that I picked up on when I got the book and started to read it was a theme that I've explored with twin themes really with many guests over the years, and it's the idea that human civilization may be much older than is conventionally accepted. Graham Hancock, who's referenced in the book, he has a blog post series called Stuff Just Keeps Getting Older. You know, the dates for things get rolled further back in the past. So there's that idea of like human antiquity being much greater than is commonly accepted. And there's also the idea of advanced civilization in the distant past. You know, we labor under the misapprehension that progress is linear, going from, you know, primitive to advanced, and that line continues, and we're somewhere, you know, we today are somewhere on that line, and things generally are going up. History tells us different, of course. There's been dark ages and golden ages, and all of our myths and, you know, stories and religions speak about these things. So that's really at the core of all this. I think it's almost like concepts around which you hinge a lot of what you're writing about in the book. Also, the idea of a global culture. Again, the conventional timelines speak of atomized, you know, peoples around the globe as populations grew, gradually coming into contact with each other, and civilizations developing. That may well have been the case. That logically makes sense, you know, in evolutionary terms. But it's seen really that globalization in terms of culture is something that's really only happened in the last, you know, maybe couple of thousand years. You know, the Romans got all over the place, created an empire, you know, that fell, but the process more or less continued, and the truly globalized world that we have today is a unique feature of our time, and that's not necessarily the case. It looks like, if you read a lot of alternative researchers, that there was a global seafaring culture in the past, and we see clues to this in similar constructions and artifacts that we find in seemingly very disparate parts of the world.
Well, yeah, that is what I've noticed over the last few years. I've discovered that there was a type of architecture which is called Hanan Patcha, using the categories of architecture that Alfredo Gamarra, who was a man who lived here in Cusco, developed to really categorize the different types of archaeology that he was witnessing here in Peru. And this Hanan Patcha architecture is very strange. It's very much unlike any type of architecture that most people are familiar with. So we're used to temples, and we're used to houses in the archaeological record made out of stone and other elements. But this Hanan Patcha kind of construction is generally, it's almost like an artist playing with clay. And, you know, you don't see any of the typical things like walls or roofs or anything like that. It's just a huge monolith, which has these features like canals built into it, basins, seats that have a 90-degree angle. Sometimes they're curved, and they're perfectly curved and smooth. But it's all exposed to the elements, and it's all very strange. It doesn't look like anything, that humans are familiar with as far as buildings that actually protect us from the elements. But I discovered that not only is there a ton of this around Peru, but it's also seen in other parts of the world. Like, you can find this in Europe, you can find it in China, you can find it in Japan, and certainly under the pyramids of the Giza Plateau as well. So, you know, what I find very interesting is that there's not a lot of historians or archaeologists really talking about this much older style of architecture. And if they do, they tend to attribute it to the cultures of the areas that they work in as archaeologists. So they may say it's like some pre-Egyptian style of architecture, or here in Peru, they can call it like Royal Inca. but it's just very arbitrary, and it doesn't look like anybody's making the connection between all of these sites that are discovered all around the world, and how this can lend itself to the theory that we're seeing an advanced ancient civilization that was once all around the world. So whether this was a seafaring type of people that were, traveling the seas, going between continents, or perhaps, and I do bring this up in my book, that if this civilization is extremely old, perhaps it is connected to a time when the continents were all, fitted together at one time in the past. But that's so out of the bounds of what most mainstream archaeologists would even consider. But, because they don't really have an explanation for this Hanan Patcha style of architecture, I decided I would explore even more unconventional theories, and that is where it brought me into the theories of Alfredo Gamarra and expanding Earth theories, and also the theories that maybe we had a different elliptical cycle at some time in the past, which he brought up could explain a type of human that was living in this ancient past that could easily manipulate stone based on the fact that gravity was much less prevalent. The earth was less dense. So, these are some of the more, speculative things that I bring up in my book. But I feel it is something that we should bring up, since we have obvious evidence of this Hanan Patcha work, and there's really nothing written about it. Archaeologists don't like to really expound on it, but it's fascinating, and it's something you can actually visit and touch. That's why I'm very interested in that particular topic of Hanan Patcha. And my book attempts to get into why is this kind of being ignored when it's really everywhere around the world.
Yeah, one thing that was probably the most striking thing in reading your book was that I received it just shortly after putting together a conference presentation of my own that was entitled The Sound of the Stones, Archaeoacoustics and the Ancients. Now the footage of that hasn't been edited yet, but when it is, I'll send you a link to it, because there's some commonalities, and one of the things I talk about, a number of the things I talk about in that crop up in your book. And when I read your book, I was kind of like, no way, I've just been putting some of these ideas together. One was the expanding Earth idea. Now I've done a couple of shows on expansion tectonics in the past, and also in the conference talk, I mentioned the idea of Pangea. This was the sort of supercontinent. Well, when what we now see is separate continents, there was one landmass on the Earth. This is, the idea. And conventional geology says that plate tectonics, the movement of plates of the Earth's crust, caused the land masses to separate over a very long period of time and form the continents in the world as we see them now, of course, and things are still on the move. But of course, the expanding Earth theory is somewhat different, and it posits a much smaller Earth in the past, expanding by accruing material either from without or generating it from within. Don't ask about the mechanisms. We don't know about that, but it's just speculation. And it's the expanding Earth that caused the continents to appear as they are now. Now, in some cases, you might say, well, yes, there's pyramids all over the world, but there are different styles of pyramids. The Central American ones, whereas the South American ones, perhaps different to those in Egypt. They clearly are. Ones in wherever it happens to be, Thailand. They're just distinctly different. But then you pointed out with the sort of the architecture, if we can call it that, the megalithic work being so similar in different parts of the Earth. An expanding Earth scenario would kind of account for how something that was once clustered or, in one general area, then became scattered as as the landmass itself broke up. So it's absolutely fascinating. But even the first show I did on this with a geologist about expanding Earth tectonics, expansion tectonics, the resistance that guy has, and he's not a Graham Hancock type character. He's a very down to earth, dry. I don't mean that in a bad way, but he's just a professional geologist, and he's just has been working for most of his life on this theory. But the resistance to it is so profound. It does. I'm sure you've come up against this as well in your work. You sometimes have to ask the question: what is it that is so? Is it just like academic tenure and people's reputations on the line that they're not willing to consider theories that if proven, in future, would throw out so much of our accepted ideas about human history and of civilization in general?
Yeah. Well, that is not only in geology. You see this in the archaeological world as well. It's like, when somebody goes through higher education and they go through the graduate program of institutions, they're basically being taught by people that have kept a pretty tight narrative on how the world is created, constructed, cultures are if the Inca culture is creating these megalithic works, which is what is being instructed today in academia, you basically are being conditioned into believing in that particular storyline, in that narrative. And I believe that is what we're seeing through academia, basically, is that they're funded and, by institutions that really want to create this narrative. And I think that narrative really needs to be looked at today in light of certain evidence like this Hanan Patcha work. There's no similarities whatsoever to known Inca work or Quilque work or Wari work. So to keep saying that, oh, this is Inca construction, when we're finding it in Italy and we find it in Africa, virtually the same kind of construction doesn't really make sense. But it's hard to buck the system if you're an archaeologist and you have tenure at a university and all your peers have written papers basically defending this idea that one particular culture has built all of these constructions, and this is what's being taught for decades in here in Peru and in other institutions, basically around the world. So yeah, it's I think this is why people today are going online and looking at other perspectives, and why programs like Ancient Apocalypse with Graham Hancock are doing so well. I mean, millions of people have been viewing and appreciate his work. And he still is getting blasted by the archaeologists because it's even though I consider it very conservative, it's still basically jarring the archaeological community to say that, oh, ancient civilizations were before the Younger Dryas period of 12,000 years. So that still gets a lot of rancor, basically, in institutions and in the archaeological fields. So, but I think that there's now beginning to be there's a movement online that is saying, hey, a lot of this doesn't make sense. Let's revisit ancient history And right now, I think that's where we really need to go. We really need to examine, some of the tropes about how old human civilization is. It looks like, to me, it's much older than what mainstream science is saying.
Yeah, it looks like from some online posts I saw recently, it looks like Keanu Reeves is one of the guests on season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, because Graham Hancock posted, "Oh, thank you for Keanu Reeves being so, generous with his time, whatever." So, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. He's just a high-profile celebrity, and we know that celebrities weighing in on academic topics often doesn't end well. But I still think it's significant that someone that that's so well known by so many people is listening to someone so marginalized by Graham. I mean, Graham is a best-selling author. He's been doing this for a long time. He's got a big audience, but still marginalized by the mainstream. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of traction season 2 picks up. On a related note, wouldn't it be amazing if we could date stone in the way that we can carbon date other archaeological materials? The only thing about that being, if you date stone and it said this stone was formed at this time, of course that says nothing about when it was used for construction. So that would only help up to a point, wouldn't it? It'd say, oh, this stone is in some they can estimate by the other characteristics of the rock. They can say, oh, this was probably formed at such and such a period, however many billion years ago. But again, it doesn't tell us anything about when it was cut or moved or formed or vitrified or anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. And right now, what archaeologists typically do is they look for like artifacts which are typically around these monoliths and megaliths, which they can carbon date. But this creates a lot of errors because we don't know exactly when these pottery shards were left at particular sites. For instance, like if we find Kilka pottery next to a megalithic or a monolithic site, sometimes it tends to get, this is how they interpret how old that megalithic site is, by the pottery that is found around it, or any other, carbon that can be dated. But, the way that cultures and societies migrate, there are frequently different cultures that discover a site and they build settlements near it. They create their pottery near it. So to say that this is, to make a comparison that this, because we found a pottery shard near a megalith, must indicate the age of the site is a really, I think, an erroneous way to do archaeology. But this is still done today. So, we have to look at it with different metrics, and maybe you're right. We need to look at it where our geologists are coming in. So different disciplinaries are coming in to study the strata of the earth, so we can see approximately when they believe like limestone rock or andesite was being created, because that would give us a better indication of when these sites were actually created.
Well, it's like finding, I don't know, the remains of a Coca-Cola can at the site of a medieval castle or something, maybe archaeologists 1,000 years from now or 2,000 years from now saying, okay, so we know from the human record, that Coca-Cola was a cultural phenomenon in this time, and it was found in this castle. So this is,
Yes.
or whatever. But I mean, I live in a city here in the north of England, and talking about sites and about population migration. So it seems, from what we can tell in the archaeology, that the first real development in the area I live in There would have been people living around here. Who knows what their lifestyle was like, and what sort of settlements they had. But the first big thing we've got a record of in stone, it was a Roman fortress. Okay, so from the first century AD, you can find people who know about these things. I'm no expert. Have said, well, here we have obviously when the Romans eventually left Britain, more or less, when they officially pulled out militarily, these fortresses and things that fell into ruin. Well, here we find the stone reused, and why wouldn't you? If stone's already been quarried and used and it's cut into blocks, you just reuse it for something else. And we can see here in my city, Roman stone, and again, other experts who've explained to me, look, this has been faced by a stone axe. This looks like it's from the Roman fortress. This is in such and such a style. Here we find it incorporated into something in the Anglo-Saxon period. Here we find it over here incorporated into the Norman period. Then you're into like the 11th century. So 1,000 years apart. So that obviously muddies the waters as well. But you can't infer the age of any of these necessarily, just particularly if you're using stones that aren't really distinct in terms of style. If you see what I mean, you can say, oh well, from everything else we know about the historical record and archaeology, this style of stone carving, for example, suggests this period. If it's just lumps of stone, these things get repurposed all the time, and it would seem likely that in Europe, here in Britain, and probably all around the world, different time periods, when there has been a kind of a dark age, just to use that cliche term, a bit of a downturn, civilizational downturn, that people have reused sites through just sheer need. So they stop building. Construction is one of the great signs of an upswing in civilization, isn't it? But downturns, people hunker down, hard times. They use what's already there. They repurpose things. You can see how you compare Roman pottery, fine Roman pottery, for a noble family, how decorated and how well made it is, to pottery that appears to have been made in the so-called Dark Ages in Europe. And so much is lost. The Dark Age pottery is so just functional. It's just designed to be a bowl or a jug. The decoration isn't there. So yeah, this is just what I've been saying, really, just thinking about the rise and fall and cycles that I alluded to earlier, and repurposing of things. So you just can't infer, you can't join these things together that you were saying earlier on. You say, we have two here, we have two here, therefore, it equals 5. It's not necessarily like that.
Right. And yeah, you can see when the Spanish came to Peru, they basically, all they could do was take the smaller stones from sites like Saxe Woman, because there was no way they knew how to move these large megalithic stones that you find at the Citadel. And but you can see where they took the smaller stones and actually incorporated into their own buildings, their colonial buildings. Which is kind of fascinating about Cusco, is because you can see such a mishmash of different building materials from different cultures. And you can find that in pretty much all the streets down in the center near the Plaza de Armas. And so you can see like larger stones from the actual megalithic sites that they actually can manage to bring down. But you also see, Inca construction, and kind of the worst construction in comparison is actually the colonial. And you see, you'll notice there's not the perfectly fitted rocks, that you'll see a lot of mortar work that is put in, and they seem to just kind of throw the rocks haphazardly in their buildings. So the real superior work was the older work, not only from the Incas, but the pre-Inca work that you see in the megalithic sites were just amazing, as far as the accuracy of how they, fitted the large stones together, and the smooth surfacing. So I'm sure, and it is recorded that the Spanish were amazed by what they saw up at Sacsayhuaman, and they really didn't understand how these massive stones fitted together perfectly were actually created. There are historians, for instance, there's Gaciolosa de la Vega, and he witnessed some building by the Inca, which was happening on Sacsayhuaman, but he also said there were, whatever the Incas were doing at the site, what was there much early, the culture before had created a much superior site. So there are a number of these testimonies by the chronicalistas that do mention that the people that were there at the time of the Inca were saying there was an earlier, more advanced civilization that was there. So at least we do have those records that we can refer to.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's very well documented in your book. I'm reminded when you mentioned there about, the Spanish and, being unable to move the larger stones, just not having the know-how to do that. Clearly, these stones were quarried and cut and moved. Or when they say cut, even in some of the techniques, mysterious techniques that you mentioned in the book, how they were formed, it's very, very strange indeed. I mentioned vitrification earlier on, but it's almost like the stones were softened, in the way you might soften, wax or clay or something like that, and then sort of molded into shape, and then hardened again. So that's which is one of the things about that type of construction that you're talking about. One of the most noticeable things about it is these irregular shaped stones, but put together with kind of mathematical laser-like precision. The tolerances and the lack of the gaps between them. It's one thing to have regular blocks cut. Say, look, let's fast forward to the modern age. If we've got a big laser-guided stone cutter, cut blocks that are ostensibly identical, you can put those together, with no gaps between them. You wouldn't be able to get cigarette paper in there, but to do it with these stones that have almost like almost organic shape to them and a degree of randomness to the untrained eye, it is absolutely incredible. And you've got lots of photographs in the book as well, which is very helpful. You can actually take a look at these things and find more online. So yeah, that's one of the most fascinating things about it. For anybody interested in the megalithic era, megalithic civilization, I think the one that you're kind of focusing on is one that hasn't had that much attention paid to it. Not certainly in my experience, anyway.
Well, the megalithic sites have, there's a lot of attention about them, not only, in the archaeological community, but also online. And people are really fascinated with them, and they should be. I mean, they're really amazing. And we still don't know exactly how they were created and, how they were quarried, how they were moved, and then fitted together. And that tends to be, if you look at conventional archaeology, they say this was all done with copper tools and bronze tools and sometimes pounding stones. But, when you see these 90-degree and perfect edges and how they are fitted together, I don't know how they can say the Inca did this. And when they say that the civilization was only about 93 years in existence, I don't think they have enough manpower throughout all of Peru to do something like this in such a limited time.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com